Hey all, good evening everyone. Welcome to Malaysia Dynamics 365 and Power Platform User Group. Happy New Year everyone. And so this is our first starting session of this year 2023. And like you guys might be aware of it, we started our user group somewhere 2 years back, and every month we are back to back. We are running the monthly meetups, and every quarterly once we do run the Asia and Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform meetups in the Asia and level. And these are the events we do. And every month, like we do the monthly events. Like till now, like we were doing the online events, but going forward, like we are planning to do the in-person events in the Microsoft Malaysia office. So that's our plan. And even if it is an in-person event also, all those videos and the content will be uploaded in this channel, and it will be live telecasted through this channel. So you guys please subscribe to this channel, and you can please feel free to learn the Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform contents. And today we have Wael Hamze here, and he is especially known for the Power Platform and the Dynamics 365 DevOps, and he has his own extensions in the marketplace. Before the Microsoft released the Microsoft Power Platform build tools, and extensively people were using the Wael Hamze tools. And we all aware, all the Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform enthusiasts are aware of Wael Hamze, and he is today with us, and he is going to walk us through the ALM for the Power Platform data. And he has been invited a couple of times, and he has given this presentation in our UG. And today also we have requested him. And thanks for accepting our invitation and presenting here today. Well, thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. And yeah, over to you, Will.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. I think it's been almost 3 years since I last spoken in this user group. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me again. I believe last time, as far as I can remember, I did talk about DevOps in general for the Power Platform. So yeah, it's good to be back, and it's good to be talking about a related topic, but a slightly different topic today, which is about ALM for Power Platform data. So hopefully you find this session useful, and we'll probably build on some of the things we discussed in the last session. So in terms of the agenda for the day, so we're going to do a little bit of introduction to data. Then we're going to look at what's the typical workflow like when it comes to working with data and Power Platform. And then we're going to look at some tools that you can use to automate some of the processes, and how these then tools can be used as part of your pipelines to automate some of the processes. And then finally, at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A to answer any questions that you may have. So before we start, just in case you don't know me, so I'm Wael Hamze. I'm a Power Platform lead and Business Applications MVP. I've put in a few links to some of the kind of social channels that I use. So feel free to connect on LinkedIn, or follow me on some of the other blogs or YouTube channels as well. All right, so let's get started. Let's do a little bit of introduction to Dataverse, because it's very relevant to that topic that I'm going to be discussing today, which is more around data. So Power Platform comes with a lot of capabilities. So you've got Power BI, for example, for generating insights. You've got Power Apps for the user experiences, Power Automate for the business processes, and then we've got also Power Virtual Agents for chatbots, and Power Pages, obviously, for developing user experiences for externally facing customers. So all of these capabilities allow you to kind of build lots of business features very quickly, and that is all in most cases is powered by Dataverse. So Dataverse is where you build your data models, and this is where the data will sit in a lot of cases. You could use connectors, obviously, to augment your data and Dataverse with other data sources, but there is lots of data that's going to be sitting in Dataverse, and there are lots of ways around automating solutions and moving the functionality over from Dataverse into multiple environments. But today I'm going to be focusing on the data aspect of Dataverse, and how we manage that within our the typical application lifecycle management and DevOps processes. Okay, so let's talk about the data and Dataverse. So Dataverse obviously is one of the things that it does, in addition to all the kind of intelligent things around security and model-driven apps and all this kind of stuff. It's got the storage at one of the core features. So from a storage perspective, you've got the database storage. So this is where the tables and metadata will sit in there. We also got the file storage, so you can support things like your attachments, photos, videos, and we also got the log storage for audit data and things like that. So you've got lots of different types of storage in Dataverse to allow you to store different things the optimal way. So that's quite important kind of when considering some of the processes that we're going to look at later. So in terms of types of data, so we obviously got metadata. So this is like the description of the information that you have. So for example, the definition of your tables, some of the relationships, some of the configurations and customizations that you may have, that is all classed as metadata. And then you've got the configuration data. So this is how you configure the system. So you may, I don't know, have some environment variables or things like that. So these are kind of dependent on the environment. So this would be classed as configuration. So metadata is kind of defines how the system looks like, and then the configuration is the kind of how you configure it for a specific scenario. And then we got the reference data. So once you kind of have your system in place, typically you will have some records in the system that are more or less static. So these are referred to the reference table. So things like lookups, pick lists, and some of the other kind of tables you may have. And then we have the business data. So once you have the reference data, then you kind of typically have business data. And this is the kind of business data that the user is going to be entering into the system or interacting with and changing on frequent basis. And then you got the audit data. So once you've got the user interactions within the system, changes to the data, then there will be some audit that gets recorded in terms of who did what on that data, which is also very important. So in terms of so when it comes to kind of DevOps and other things, it's important to consider the purposes of data, because data will have different purposes in different contexts. So for starters, we have dev data. So this is the data that you would have in your dev environment, and it's purely for development purposes. So typically is not very structured, but you create it to test something very quickly in your development or build something. And then you have the test data. So this is a bit more structured. So this is where you will typically be using this type of data in your test environment, and you may have different scenarios to cater for the different things that you may want to test in that environment. So that's typically referred to as the test data. You also have sample data. So if you want to do demos or you want to spin up an environment to kind of showcase certain things. So this was called as sample data. It's slightly different from test data because it's kind of designed to show you the end-to-end picture, and it's very good for demos. It kind of showcases some of the functionalities you may have. So you may have some charts, for example, in your that you want to demo. So you would need to have some data that shows you some information that can kind of bring that chart to life. For example, activities due today. So you might want to have some activities that are due on that day, so you can make sense of that data and understand what that chart is trying to say. And then obviously finally we got production data. So this is the data that real users will be creating in our production environment. So these are the different kind of types of data you may be interacting with, but each type of data may have a different process and life cycle. So as part of a DevOps process, you need to consider these different types of data. So typically you would have different packages, for example, for your test data and your sample data. And production data is typically used created by users, but you may have some data migration processes from legacy systems or from other systems that you may want to consider as well. And finally, it's quite important as well to consider the sensitivity of the data. So each organization will typically have different levels of sensitivity or the way in which these types of sensitivity applies to the organization. But in general, there is more or less three or around 3 or 4 categories. So public, general, confidential, highly confidential data. So when we build DevOps processes, it's important to consider what type of data that is. So for example, it may be okay to store public or general data and version control and move that across the environments, but it may not be okay for your organization to store, for example, confidential or highly confidential data in version control. So knowing what type of data it is and who can access that data is quite important, because then you can put your controls and make sure that that data is stored in the right place. So for example, for credentials, you would store them in somewhere like the Key Vault, or some secret places. You wouldn't necessarily store them in version control. Equally, if you've got production data, you may have very different controls around that. So these are the kind of different things. Just wanted to bring these up because when we build processes, it's important to consider all the different aspects and angles that you can kind of think of when it comes to data. Okay, so let's look at data types and what data types we need to consider when we're building ALM processes and DevOps. So if we think about metadata, for example, so metadata, you need for example, ALM for metadata, but typically that data is fixed. So if you define a table, that's going to be more or less the same across all your environments. So the environment variance, there's unlikely to be anything in there. It is solution aware, so you can, that kind of changes is typically more or less all of them are included in the solution. There may be some gaps, obviously, but typically metadata you put in a solution, you transfer it across the environments. Configuration data, you need to configure, obviously, your environments as part of your LLM process. And typically that's the data that is variable per environment. So things like environment variables, they may have one value in one environment and they may have another value in another environment. And you can do that as part of the solutions, obviously. So that's again covered. And then we've got the reference data. So reference data is required as part of ALM because it's important to have good reference data in all your environments. Typically, that data doesn't change per environment, but is not part of the solutions as well. So we have to kind of think about how we manage it. And then we have the business data. You may or you may not need to consider it from a DevOps perspective because it may be just new data that's created by users. But you may have some data migration that you may need to perform, and you may want to automate some processes in there, and it's obviously not part of the solution. And then you have audit data. You don't need to worry about that, obviously, for ALM processes, because that's the data that just gets created automatically when you change the records. It's obviously different per environments, and it's not relevant for the solutions. So these are just the different types of data and whether we need to think about it from an ALM perspective. So for today's session, we're going to focus on the things that are not part of the solution. So we're going to focus on reference data and how you can manage that reference data as part of your application lifecycle. Okay, so I've created a little bit of a demo today to kind of bring some of these concepts to life. So this is the cut of the data that I'm going to have in my system today in Dataverse. So we're going to have a list of foods, and each food belongs to a category. So there's a relationship between these two. And then each food kind of is made up of a number of different nutrients. Again, so there are relationships between these two. So if you think about it, the food is more, anyone can create their own foods, let's say. So that's classed as business data. And then we got the food categories and the nutrients, which is kind of more or less static. So that's going to be our reference data. So in today's demo, we're going to see how we can move this reference data from one environment to another, and how that relates then into the reference data, how we move the reference data, and how that relates into some of the business data that we may have or we want to build on in the system. So let me just show you how that looks like in Dataverse. So this is my dev environment. So it's already got, as you can see, a list of foods in here with all the different properties. So for example, if you want to select any of these foods. For example, if we look at biryani chicken, so if we open that one, so you can see this is a business data class as business data, let's say. So you got the name, and you can see that it's got some category in here. So now we're kind of going into reference data. So this is a fixed category, for example. And then once you kind of want to see what that food is made up of, for example, you can go into the contents of that food, and you can see like all the different breakdown in terms of how much protein and all the other vitamins and minerals that food is made up of. So obviously this is business data that's going to change very frequently based on what food it is, but it all kind of references to these static data points which don't change very often. So if I look at, for example, let's go into the categories. So these categories are unlikely to change, very often. So you can see I've got a table of different categories, and they've got a parent. So there is like a parent relationship here, and equally the nutrients as well. These more or less been stable for a very long time, so they're unlikely to change. So these are the type of data that I would class as reference data. And I want to make sure that that data is available in all of my environments and it's more or less the same. So I've got that consistency, and then I can build different types of, for example, foods and other things on top of that data. So let's continue with the presentation and see then how we can automate some of these processes going forward. So we've talked about the reference data. So before we kind of discuss any details, I just wanted to bring this picture because typically we would have different people working in the project. So we may have some citizen developers, we may have some business users, we also may have some pro developers working and interacting with the data. So there will be different personas on the team with different skills and different interests. So we need to make sure that any processes that we build for data will obviously work for all the different people that we have on the team. So we'll take a look at some of the examples today in the presentation as well. Okay. So the first thing, I'm going to introduce the configuration migration tool. So this tool has been around for a very long time. It's part of the the standard SDK for Power Platform, Dataverse. So you can get this tool from basically the NuGet library. There's multiple ways now you can get this tool, so I'll show you in a second. But it is available as part of the NuGet library, and there is a PowerShell module as well, which allows you to do some automation. But basically, the way this works is you've got a source environment, so that's your Dataverse source environment. And you will have data and metadata in that environment. So metadata is what tables you have, and the data is what are the records that you actually have in these tables. And so typically when you want to kind of move data from one environment, you need to decide what data you want to move. So it could be business data, it could be reference data, it could be different type of things. So you need to tell the system what you want to move. So typically you will have a schema file. So the schema file will basically decide on what tables, columns, and how they relate to each other. And then once you decide what you want to move, then this tool will allow you to export that data from that source environment. And it will generate like a data.zip file. So the data.zip file basically contains the data that you've extracted, that you've defined here, plus the schema file, so it knows like what's the structure of the data. And then once you have that data.zip file, again, using the same tool, you can use basically to import that data into a target environment, which is obviously in this case a Dataverse environment as well. So basically 3 steps: define your schema using the tool, then export the data that you want, and then once you've got the data, then you can import it to more than one environment. And if anything changes, obviously you need to go through that process again, edit, export and import. So I'm just going to show you how that looks like briefly. I'm not going to basically go into the details of the tool because I'm going to focus a bit more on the automation for today's session. But basically, this is the common data service configuration migration tool. So you can create a schema. So let's go and create a new schema. So you have to sign in to the environment. So I think I've already signed into the dev environment. Sorry, let's not do this. Give me 1 second. So once we've signed in, we should be able to basically interact with that data and the schema file. Give me 1 second. Okay, so let's log in into this environment, for example. So in this case, you can start to create a new schema from scratch. But in this case, you can also load an existing schema. So let's take a look at loading an existing schema because I've already created a schema for today's demo. So I've stored it in version control. So this is what the schema looks like. Basically, you select the solution that you want to work with, and then based on the solution, you get different tables, and then you can add the different basically tables into your schema. So in this case, for my reference data, I'm interested in the let's say the nutrients, and you can see the fields that I'm selected in here. So in this case, that maps directly into these fields that I'm seeing here on the screen, apart from the created on field. And I've also got the food categories in here, and I've selected a number of fields as well, and that maps into the food categories in here as well. So I've got basically all the fields that I need to move to the next environment. Some of the good things about this tool is you've got some additional options. So you can, for example, configure the import settings. So you can disable plugins. You can choose not to update existing records if you know that you're importing and you just want to make the process faster. You can also decide how you compare your when it comes to updating the records. So do you want to compare?
Hey man,
Sorry.
sorry for interfering. The people are getting the blur screen. Can you please increase the text size in the other window?
For this one, yeah.
Yeah. The people are getting a small font and they are not able to view it seems. So can you please increase the?
Let me just see. Is this screen okay, or is the
No, the
other one?
same.
Okay, I can increase the font, yeah.
The shade screen is not sharp actually, so we are not able to read the text clearly. No, even after zooming, the text is not clear.
This one is not clear as well, yeah.
Yeah. This is not clear as well.
Shall I change the screen resolution? Maybe would that help?
I think so. We can quickly change the resolution and see.
Okay, let me stop sharing.
Yeah, sure.
I'll change the resolution, and then we can give it another try. Give me 1 moment. The presentation was okay, I presume, yeah?
Yes. The presentation was okay, but only the other screen which you have shared is not very sharp.
Okay, no problem. Let's see if we can fix it without breaking anything. Okay. Okay, I've changed the resolution. I'm going to try and share again, and
Yeah.
hopefully it'll be a little bit better. I think it's because the monitor has a high resolution, probably. So was struggling a bit. Is it better now?
Yeah, it's no. It's better compared to the previous one, but still only bits and pieces we are able to read it. It's not very sharp again.
Mm. Um, how about this window? Does it look okay?
Yeah, but yeah, but people need to like they need to focus more into it in order to get the text out of it. Well, but it's okay. It's okay. All good.
Um,
We'll take it from there.
yeah, I'll try and explain things a bit
Yeah,
more.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
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 I'm not sure if is there anything I can try, you think, or uh,
It's better a bit actually. So yeah, fine.
okay. Okay. No worries. Let's see how it goes. If it becomes unreadable, just let me know and we can think of
Yeah,
something.
sure, sure, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, all good. Take it.
Okay. So yeah, apologies for that. Let's continue. So yeah, I was saying that this tool gives us a few options when it comes to importing the data. So for example, if we've got lots of plugins that we don't want them to fire when we import the data because we only want them to fire maybe later in the processes, that we can disable that. And we can decide also how we identify whether a record is already in the system when we do run another import. So you can, for example, decide if you want to match on ID, if you want to match on code, or you can even, match on, multiple columns at the same time. So it's quite good because you got that flexibility. You can match on GUIDs if you want to have the same GUIDs across all the environments, or you can match on names or multiple columns, which is quite good. And if you don't want to export all the data from the system, because there may be cases where you don't want to do that. For example, if you've got like lots of teams or whatever you want to export, you can edit the fetch XML query here, which is quite useful. So you can put your filters in here and you can exclude, for example, fields with a certain state or certain values, which is great, really. So that is quite useful. So for the purpose of this demo, I think we basically got two tables that we want to move from one environment to another. So we're going to basically proceed with that. So this is my schema defined. So if I really wanted to, I could go now and export that data, or I could go and then import that data. I'm not going to show you how to do it from the configuration migration tool because we're going to do that through automation. But if you wanted to kind of find out a bit more about how to do it through the configuration migration tool, there's lots of documentation here on the Microsoft Docs, which basically explain, step by step how to import and export the data. So let's go back into the presentation. Hopefully the presentation is still okay in there. So the next step I'm going to talk about is the Power Platform CLI. So we obviously can manage the data from the configuration migration tool using the UI, which can be useful in a lot of scenarios if you don't want to do automation, or maybe it's one-off activity. So you've got that option. If this becomes a recurring activity and you've got lots of environments that you need to keep in sync, and you've got data that you want to make sure becomes consistent, you've got a big team, big project, then you need to kind of start looking at how do I automate and reduce the manual effort and the errors that can result as part of that. So Power Platform CLI, it's one of these tools that are getting a lot of new capabilities, and basically a command line interface that's designed for makers and admins, and to be used in automation tools as well. And it basically allows us to perform most of the actions that we want to do when we're either building components or deploying or managing components as well. So you've got a number of different options when it comes to consuming this tool. So you've got the MSI, which you can download and install. So this is what I've done for this machine that I'm working on today. And that is basically for a Windows install. It comes also as part of the Power Platform VS Code extension. But it does that one. The only caveat with that, it doesn't offer some of the features that are only available on Windows, like the configuration migration tool data. So if you want to use the configuration migration tool, you need to use that one. And you've got a package on NuGet as well. The NuGet package is useful if you want to pull packages at runtime. So if you've got a build process, for example, that you want to get that package, you can use the NuGet package, as opposed to having an install something on a server, for example. So let's do a quick demo of that tool. So let me just close this one. And yeah, let's do a demo of the configuration of the Power Apps CLI. So basically, once you install the CLI, you just type pack, which is basically shows you all the different commands that you get. And you can see that one of the commands is data, which is what I'm going to be working with today. And there's also a tools command. So the configuration migration tool that I was showing you earlier, if I do this tool, for example, it will list me all the tools that I can use with the Power Apps CLI. So in this case, you can see I can use the CMT. So all I have to do is just install the CLI and then use this command, and it will open up the configuration migration tool. So that's another useful thing about the CLI. You don't have to kind of worry about installing all the different tools. You can just use them from here. So from an export perspective, if I want to export that data, so in this case, all I have to do is basically, it's not that link. Sorry. So I've got the command here in my notepad. So I'm just going to show you how that looks. So basically all you have to do is just do pack export. You specify the schema file, and then you specify, where do you want the exported zip file to be stored, and then you specify the environment as well that you want to export it from. So once you do that, you basically run the export functionality. It will go in, it will say that you've got two entities, how many records in each entity, and we'll basically export that data and put it in a zip file. So if we go into the folder, you can see that a zip file was created in here. So if you open that file, as I mentioned previously, you've got the schema file, and then you've got the data file. So if I open the schema file, just to show you what that looks like, it's basically all the two entities that we've described that we want to, or tables that we want to import, and then you've got all the different columns that you decided, and it tells you which one is a primary key, and all the different options. All the different options around how you export and import is basically stored in this configuration file, so that when you come to export, you don't have to worry about it. You just give this file into the tool, and we'll go ahead and do what it needs to do. And in terms of the data, so the way this tool works, it puts all the data that you have in this one file. So you can see it's grouped by the entity or the table. So you can see it's got two tables in here. So the nutrients are here, and then the categories are in the other one. Okay. So if you wanted to import that data now, basically, all you have to do is basically just run another command line like this one. I'm not going to execute it now, but basically, yeah, if you do pack import, you specify the zip file and then the target environment, and we'll go ahead and import that data. So basically, using the pack CLI, once you've got the schema created using the configuration migration tool, which you have to do if you want to create it from the UI, then you can use the pack CLI to basically import and export that data. So you may have to do some additional steps because it gives you the zip file. Obviously, you may not want to store a zip file in version control, but we'll take a look at some of the options for that in a bit. Okay, so let's continue to the presentation. So that is the Power Platform CLI demo. Just a few thoughts around the configuration tool in general before we continue. So some of the good things about it, it's free, it's easy to use, as you saw already. It does manage for you all the relationships. It does support the deployment using PowerShare or Package Deployer or the CLI. So lots of options for automation. You can define your keys. You can do some additional steps on import. And you can even have the option to manage your date and time. So if you working with sample data and you want to make sure that the records are created or with a certain date or something like that, so your dashboards can work. If you're planning a demo on a day, you can use the configuration migration tool to do that. So in terms of some of the downsides of it that you may need to be aware of when you're considering your options, is basically it generates one big file, so it's difficult to track things in version control. The records in that file are not always sorted, so it's sometimes difficult to know or to kind of view changes easily in version control. Once you have that file and you decide to import that file into another environment, even if you've got most of the records in there, you will still have to process and try and import all the records, which is obviously time consuming if you've got big files. And from a logging perspective, I mean, you get a log file with all the error messages, but it's not as clean as, you get a table, this row passed, this row failed, this is the error message. So it's not the easiest troubleshooting any failures with it. It's not obviously suited for large volumes, so you don't, it's not designed for data migration and other things. So you need to just be mindful. It's primarily for reference data and things of low volume. And it may not support some of the out-of-the-box attributes or kind of tables that you may want to do, and it doesn't do deletes as well. So you need to worry about these. I mean, for deletes, there may be a few workarounds that you can do. You can either kind of write some code after the process, or you can flag a record for deletion and perhaps run like a bulk delete job after it or something. So there are workarounds, but it doesn't do it after the box if that's what you're intending to do. Okay, so let's continue. I'm gonna go into pipelines. So I'm gonna be talking a little bit around the Power Platform build tools, and I'm also gonna be talking about the XRMCI framework, which is a tool that's been around for some time, and it does offer some of the capabilities that you can use when it comes to moving data across different environments. And I'll show you exactly some of the options that it has that it can help you with some of the scenarios if you've got these challenges. And obviously, this tool works with the Power Platform build tools, so it's a free open source tool that's got different tasks for doing some of the DevOps activities, and one of them is basically managing your reference data using the configuration migration tool. So let's go into the demo, because I think that's the best way to show you how this all works. So let's go to the browser window and do a quick demo. Okay. Before we go on to that, if you need any further information about the CLI, there is a very good documentation in terms of reference. So for example, in the data, you can go in and have a look, all the different commands and parameters. You can obviously see that in the tool itself, but you've got very good documentation. So you can keep an eye on what's happening with this tool. One of the good things I've noticed about the Power Apps CLI that comes from NuGet as well, you can see all the different history on here, so you can see kind of each version, what are the different things that have changed in the Power Platform CLI. So that's quite useful as well. So yeah, let's start working with the reference data. So ideally, you want to have your reference data and version control, because that's where you can see the data, you can see your changes, and you can go back at any point in time into any version of that data and deploy it into any environment that you like. So what I like to have is a folder for data, and then another folder for the types of the data that I have. So in this case, I've stored the schema file that I've generated from the configuration migration tool in this folder. So every time I go to the configuration migration tool and I make changes to the schema file, it basically gets updated in here, and then I can save it and check it into version control, so that anyone working on the team, they're using the same consistent schema file. Otherwise, you'll get issues if everyone has their own version of the schema file. And then once Once the schema file is in version control, then you can obviously store your data in version control as well. So I'm on the master branch at the moment, and I've got the data in here. I'll talk a little bit more around why the data is in this structure, but I just wanted to show you that the file is in version control. So so if you want to change that data, obviously you can go directly into version control and change it, which is not likely what you're going to do. You will have to make sure that you stick with the same format and the tags and everything. Or you can do in here, and you can, for example, create a new record. So this is user group. Let's just assume there's a new nutrient, and let's just create one. For example, in here. So let's assume there's a new record that I want to move now, and I want to include it as part of the reference data. So I go into my dev environment, I save that record, and that record is now available in this environment. I could create another records in other tables, relationships, whatever the change includes. Once I do that, then the next step is to export that data. So in this case, I'm going to use pipelines for that. But before we do that, maybe I don't want to make the change directly in the master branch, because maybe some validation needs to run before somebody can accept that change. So let's assume that we create a new branch called UG for the user group, and then base it on the master branch, and let's just create a new branch. So then I can go into a pipeline, and I can say, you can see this pipeline is called reference data commit. So all it's going to do is export the data and check it into the version control system. So if I run this pipeline, I can select which branch I want this data to go into, and I can even change the comments on the so I can say this is like the UG commit, for example. I can update that, and then I can go back and run this pipeline. I mean, so if you're, for example, a user that doesn't typically work with version control, that's an easy way to get them to basically work in the team, because all you have to do is ask them to go into the dev environment and then run this pipeline. You can even create like a simple app that triggers this process. So there is a number of ways you can make this process easier, or you can base it off a trigger in Dataverse or something. So this is gonna run now, but while it runs, I'm just gonna basically show you what this pipeline is doing. So it's using the Power Platform or the Power DevOps tools to start with. So there is a installer task, which the main purpose of the installer task is basically to tell it what version of the tools you want to use. So you can see you can specify different versions for the different tools. And if you're talking about the configuration migration, there is this version that you can specify. So for example, if you don't specify anything, it will use that version, which is .64. If you type latest, it will use the latest version. So it's up to you really what version you want to use, but you want to make sure ideally that the import and export are running on the same version. And if you want to know what versions you have, obviously you can come in here to the PowerShell gallery, and you can see the configuration migration tool. So it's currently on version 76, and I'm using the previous version, which is 64. So if you want to use the latest version, obviously you can change it to 76, or you can type latest. So that's the good thing about using this installer. It allows you to control what version you want to use. And then the next step is to basically export the data. So to export the data, you need to specify the connection string to the environment. So this is basically using the standard formats of the connection strings from the SDK, which is in this case a client secret configuration. Then you need to specify the schema file. So this is the schema file that I stored into version control. You can see it's in that folder. And then you need to specify where the data zip file needs to go. So I've put it like in a temporary directory. And that's basically, that's all it does basically. It goes into, takes that schema file and exports it into a data.zip file. You can do the same thing with the configuration with the Power Platform build tool. So there's an export data task. So similarly, you provide a connection to the dev environment, and then the schema file and the data.zip file. So it's pretty much the same process. You can't control what version it uses. It probably uses like a latest stable version. But yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. Now, once you've got the zip file in that temporary folder, you don't want to check that file into version control, because that's not going to be helpful if you just have a zip file in version control. So what the Power DevOps tools has is an additional task, which is called extract data. So similar to the way you extract solutions into version control or unpack the solution, you can unpack the data as well. So basically you give it that zip file and then you tell it what folder you want to unpack it into. So it will run basically an unpack of that data. And you've got some additional options in here. So you can sort the data. If you sort the data, then it will be easy for you to see, if you add records in terms of where they're kind of going into that file. But you can also split the data into multiple files. So this is what I like to do. I like to split the data into different entities. So I've got a different entity for each, or different file for each table, which is quite useful, because otherwise if you've got like 20, let's say you have 20 reference tables and then you commit that one file into version control, it's very difficult to see which kind of table you've changed, whereas this one you can easily see what's going on. So after I do that, I basically run some command lines to commit that data into version control, and then I create a pull request, which then can be reviewed and approved if all is good. So so let's go and have a look at it in terms of how it looks. So the build has basically ran, executed successfully. You can see all the different details around extracting the data. There's full logs in here in terms of what's going on, what files are getting generated. You can see it's splitting that file into these two files. So that is done now. So after this build is done, basically, I can go into my branches and I can look into this UG branch. And if I browse into that directory, let's take a look at data, and I've made a change into this table. Actually, you can even go in history now. You can see this is the commit that we've put in, and you can see that you've added a record into that table. I've done a previous record in the previous run, so that's why it's adding 2 records, because I haven't committed that change. But this is the record that we've just added now for the user group. The other thing that I did, obviously, is created a pull request. So if I go on active pull request, you can see there is a reference data changes UG pull request. So you can get somebody to review that, have a look at what data has changed, and decide whether that's a change. And you can see only that file was changed. It hasn't changed the other food category table, because I didn't make any changes to that data. So the next step is to basically take these changes. If you want to deploy this to another environment, the next step is to take these changes and basically generate the zip file again. So we've got another pipeline for that. So all I have to do is just run this pipeline. I'm not going to complete the pull request, but I've got the option here to choose what data I want to package in case I want to deploy it, see how it looks in the next environment. So if I run this pipeline now, it should basically generate a package for me. So this one should be very quick, hopefully. All right. So this one is all it's doing is just basically running on version control. But as with the previous one, I'm just going to show you what it's doing actually. So very simple. Again, the tool installer, and then remember in the last build we did an unpack on the configuration data. So this one we're doing pack. So we're doing the exact opposite. So we're basically asking it to look into that folder, which is basically got the extracted files with the different entities. and we're telling it to basically generate that zip file, and then we're basically uploading it as an artifact that we can use later. So that build's completed now, so you can see there is one artifact which contains the data.zip file. So now I've basically gone from having the data in a dev environment, putting that data in version control in a good format, and then basically generating that data again. And then the zip file again. Okay. So let's do that. Let's see how we can deploy the release. Okay. So now that we've got that zip file, we want to deploy it to one or more environments. So let's create a new release. So all you have to do is just select the build. So once we select the build, which is this reference data build, I can do a create on that release, and it should basically kick off a new release into an environment, into my kind of build environment for testing purposes. Again, let's just show you what that release is looking like while it's running. So let's have a look at the tasks. So again, you can use the installer, and then there is another task called import the configuration migration data. You can use also the Power Platform build tools. I've tried the Power Platform build tools for that as well. So all you have to do is just give it the environment name and the connection, and you can give it the zip file. So you can basically, this is the zip file from the build. You can send it into that folder. Basically, this is picking up the folder from the build. But in this case, I'm using the Power DevOps tools. So again, is using the same zip file, same connection, more or less. One of the other options that I've added into this task is it allows you to have some additional configuration around the configuration migration tool. So there are some options for import that that are not available in this task at this point in time, at least. So if you want to map users, for example, if you've got user X in one environment, by environment, the next environment becomes user Y, you can do that mapping between users. You can have, again, a little bit more options around where you want to put the logs, connection timeouts and threads and things like that. So if you need these features, you've got the option to use this task, or you've got the option to use the Pack CLI, or even use the PowerShell module directly if you wish to do that as well. So let's go back in here, see where that release has been up to. So this release has completed. Again, you can, let's look at the logs, for example. You can see the import is running. It tells you exactly, how it's processing through the records and what records are happening. This is verbose at the moment, but you can obviously make it simple if you wanted to. So you get a lot of information from it, and you can even download the logs to see what happened, during the build or release if you've got any failures. So basically, this is the target build environment. If I go into UG, you see the record's been created just now. So that's my record, basically, that's been created using the configuration migration process. So fairly straightforward. Once you got the schema file, all you have to do is just kick off a few builds and releases, and the data movement element gets taken care of, and you get consistent data in your environments. So let's go back into the presentation just to finish things off. Data flows, I just wanted to talk a little bit about data flows, because we're talking about the configuration migration data, but there is a few features in Dataverse that are useful as well. So with data flows, it's again designed to move data around and transform data. So you've got the data source, which could be Dataverse, it could be a file, it could be any other data source. There's a number of data sources that are supported. Some of the SaaS or PaaS components in Azure and other third parties are supported. So with data flows, you've got a very powerful transformation engine. So you could transform that data, whichever way you want, and then the data flow basically runs in the cloud. It doesn't run in your obviously DevOps agent, and then it can push data into your target environment, which is in this case Dataverse. So with the configuration migration tool, you're moving data from Dataverse into Dataverse. Here you got multiple sources, and it will push data into Dataverse as well. So let's just take a look at some of the pros and cons of Dataflows when it comes to using them for ALM processes. These are not the general kind of pros and cons, but just in the context of the ALM process. So they're included in a lot of the licensing that you may have already. Again, it's very easy to use with the Power Query. You can do lots of transformations. You can get data from different sources, and you can still put the data into Dataverse. And they can be added into the solutions. However, the solution support is, at least the last time I checked, it wasn't that mature yet. There was a few limitations, and it doesn't work with version control, I believe, at the moment. What have I used the data flows for? So let's have a look again back into the demo. So you may be wondering, you've seen a lot of data in here in the Dataverse environments. How did I get this data into Dataverse initially? So I've used some of the data flows to get that data into Dataverse initially. So for example, if you look at the food categories, if I added this flow in here, data flow, basically I started off with an Excel file, which has got different columns, and then I did some minor transformations to it, and then I basically let me just it's taking a bit of time to load. Basically, I started with an Excel file. I did some minor transformations, and then basically I kind of mapped the columns from the Excel into Dataverse. So that was how I got some of the initial data into Dataverse. And then once I had the data into Dataverse, then I started to manage it in Dataverse and then move it from one Dataverse environment to another. So yeah, I mean, Dataflows is another option that you can decide when and where to use it. So in this scenario, I've decided to kind of initially I had some data and lots of Excel files, and I use the Dataflows to move them into my environment in Dataverse. And then once I've done that, then I could extract that data from Dataverse into version control and manage it that way going forward. So it just gives you some additional options, obviously. So I think, yeah, we're coming to the hour. So I just wanted to, thank you for obviously attending the session, and I just want to leave you some time for Q&A. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I can see one question in the chat window. The question is like, can we use the CSV data in the pipeline in order to move the reference data? I'm showing the question in the screen, so you can see the question on the screen.
Yeah, let me just go back to the invite. Okay. So can we use the CSV data? That's a good question. You can use CSV data. So the configuration migration tool basically works based on XML data, but you can obviously export data from Dataverse into CSVs, and you can create CSVs yourself as well. There is a capability which is called the package deployer, and which is another tool that you can use, which is basically a package that you can use it to import solutions and data using the configuration migration tool, but also additionally supports CSVs. So if you have CSVs, you could consider using the package deployer to do that. Obviously, you'll have to kind of create a project in C# and check it into version control, and then use the package deployer task to do that. But it is supported as well. I mean, that you could. I mean, if you've got data in CSV, the other thing you could do is you could obviously use a data flow to move that into Dataverse, and then use a configuration migration tool to take it forward. Obviously, for kind of a bit more sophisticated requirements like data migration, other things, you could also look at the Azure Data Factory, which is supports a bit more complex, high volume migrations. Any other questions?
No, all good. Well, like, guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat window in the
Yeah.
comment box.
yeah, I mean, feel free to, yeah, let's see, there's another question.
Yeah, there is a question from Tammy. Is there possible to do create, update, or delete existing data from one environment to another, or is just pure create only?
So using the configuration migration tool, you can do creates and updates. It does work with the creates and updates. It doesn't do deletes. For deletes, you have to use a different mechanism. You can either flag the record for deletion. So for example, you could change the state of the record on another field and then delete all the records of a certain that have a certain flag. If deletes is something you regularly do, yeah, I mean, then you may have to look at a different option. But in general, people, I think, when it comes to business data and reference data, they tend to deactivate the records because you may have records that will be referencing these records already in the system, with the exception of obviously if you're running a UAT and you kind of suddenly got into UAT and decided that actually half the records are no longer required, then obviously you don't want to kind of maybe leave them there. So yeah, you can look at some bulk deletion for these. Any other questions from anyone?
No, all good.
Yeah, feel free to reach out to me, obviously, on the channels that I've posted initially. I'll put the link, I'll put them back on the screen here in case you've got any questions later. Yeah, feel free to reach out to me.
Yep. Thanks once again, Wael, for accepting our invitation and presenting in Malaysia Dynamics 365 Power Platform User Group. It was a wonderful session on the ALM for the Power Platform data. Now the people got an idea of how they can easily move the data from one environment to another using the ALM application lifecycle management. Thanks for that. Thanks a lot.
No worries, you're welcome. Yeah, have a good day or evening, wherever you may be. And yeah, looking
Yeah.
forward to come and present again in the future on perhaps a different topic.
Yeah. We are also looking forward to have lots and lots of session in our user group. Well,
Yeah,
thanks once again.
sounds good.
And yeah, and thanks everyone for joining today. Like, yeah, next month we are planning to have our global power platform boot camp. So that's going to be an so one day whole the workshop session. It's going to be there in the Malaysia Microsoft office, but we are working on it, and we'll keep you posted through the meetup.com site. And I will share the meetup.com site in the comment section. So please feel free to subscribe to it so that you will get the latest updates on the Malaysia Dynamics 365 Power Platform user group.
Yep.
Thanks once again, everyone, for joining. And also, if you guys would like to speak in our user group event, then always please feel free to reach out to either myself, Temi, or PK Hong. So please feel free to reach out to us, and I will put the LinkedIn handle in the chat window. Yeah. Thanks once again, guys. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you all in the next month event. Thanks. Cheers. Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.